Okay, I think we got it. All right, Commissioner Peirce, thank you very much for coming to this meeting of the Securities Regulation Committee of the New York City Bar Association. It's a great way to kick off. I just became chair. And so having you here, I've set the expectations far too high. I don't know how I'm going to follow up. But I do want to thank Christina Thomas for putting this together. And if anything good comes out of the time I'm chair, it will be, I'm sure, because of Christina. So just to start out, I think I speak for a lot of people in the room that what has been missing a little bit over the last few years compared to the beginning of my career is an interaction with the staff at the commission. We used to have clear timelines and when we can expect comments to come back. I think we used to have a little bit more engagement, at least in my experience, with the staff. That was also very helpful. Now issuers are a little bit in the dark of when they're going to get comments back. The normal cadence is gone. I think sometimes new positions are taken suddenly by the staff over the last few years. And I think that sometimes has come without the input from practitioners that I do think as a voice to listen to. I think it seems to me over the last few years, the input has come out of the faculty lounges and not so much from the practitioners. And I think the ecosystem is very, very important. And I hope your presence here today is encouragement for others at the commission to engage with practitioners going forward, something that I really miss. So we'll start now with I just want to make that little intro for you. So we want to hear about your path to becoming SEC commissioner.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I appreciate the chance to talk with you, and it is good to hear from practitioners. So I hope we can keep this conversational as well. I have to start out by saying that, yeah, I hope it's a good sign that I'm here, but I also am here just in my own capacity as a commissioner, not necessarily representing the views of the commissioner or my fellow commissioners. So how did I get to, well, I mean, I have an academic background too, so I guess maybe I'm part of the problem here.
No, not at all, not at all. My whole reading list is from the footnotes of your dissents.
But anyway, yeah, I mean, my path to the commission started really at the commission. And I never thought I wanted to come back as a commissioner, but, you know, life sometimes surprises you. And it surprised me in the sense that I had the opportunity to come back. And I think having the chance to think about how policy is made from the outside, then you start at some point wanting to see if you can be part of that from the inside. So that was my path.
So over the last few years, I have to admit, I've all the stuff I learned about admin law, I never thought would come into practice. And that wasn't a great class for me, but it was interesting. Now I think we've all learned a lot about the commission and how it works and votes that the commission has, some of them being 3-2 recently. What's it like as a commissioner? What's day to day as a commissioner?
Yeah, and it is, I think one thing I really regret about the way admin law is taught in law school is that you really do need to know what goes on inside that black box of the agency, because every agency is different. And the SEC certainly is, sorry, is a different kind of agency. Hang on a second, I'm not cold. Yeah, so I mean, the SEC, I think, works a little bit differently than a lot of other agencies because there are 5 of us. And day to day is a lot of reading, especially now that we put out these very long rules. So I have to read them too. I do feel bad for you all, but I have to read them too. And then enforcement actions, reading enforcement actions, there are a lot of those these days. So I spend a lot of time doing that. But then there are just a lot of meetings with people inside and outside the commission. And it's, for me, that's one of the delights of the job, right? I get to learn from people inside the commission, but also get to learn a lot from people outside. And so I was glad that you opened up with what you opened up with, because these are the kinds of things that I need to hear from people. I don't see that part of the commission's work. The commissioners used to review every filing. If we did that still, you'd be waiting a lot longer. But I think that part of what the commission does is so important, yet we really don't get a window into it. I know those people in disclosure review are working very hard, but if there are problems, you need to elevate those to us so that we can raise those when we talk to Corp Fin.
I think that may come up in the Q&A afterwards. People may raise issues with you. So I think the SEC plays a great role, and I think it's looked up to by many jurisdictions around the world. And it's a great responsibility for all the commissioners to run the SEC. What keeps you up at night right now?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that keep me up at night. I mean, one is just the idea that the commission, I think, has gotten to be part of the story instead of part of the solution. And so the role of the commission is to keep the framework within which the markets can operate. And the goal of having a 5-member commission is that you have more policy continuity over time. You're not swinging from one extreme to the other extreme, but you're really, everyone cares about capital markets. We're just trying to keep the rule set making sense. That doesn't mean that you never change the rules, but it means you do so incrementally. And I think recently we've really become part of the story in the sense of we're just doing so much at once. And that can be very disruptive to the markets, and that's exactly not what I want. So that's one thing is our own role in creating instability, I think is not good. That's something that we can change, obviously. So that's the good part of that. And then I do worry that some of the bread and butter things in the markets get forgotten maybe. And so I think we're not spending enough time on some bread and butter type rulemakings that we could be spending time on. And then you always worry about the market and what might happen in the markets. And that's, and who might get hurt if something goes wrong. So that always is going to keep a commissioner up at night. Some of that is not in our control, obviously. There are a lot of factors that go into that.
So you've been pretty vocal as an SEC commissioner. I think your dissents are widely read. I think at times people read the dissent before the commission's position. I know I've been guilty of that. You also have a reputation, I think, for trying to solve problems like the crypto sandbox. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because I do think that's a big issue of what to do with crypto, and also talk about other accomplishments you're proud of as an SEC commissioner.
So on the sandbox point, the original sandbox that I proposed several years ago was really to address this problem of people doing a token offering and the purchasers of those tokens needing to get some kind of disclosure. Could we build a disclosure framework that really made sense for tokens, not trying to impose an IPO type structure on crypto offerings, which didn't make sense. So that was one. And then more recently, that was sort of a safe harbor proposal. Then more recently, I proposed a sandbox, a micro innovation sandbox that wouldn't only be for crypto, but we could adapt that to lots of things. And I think that sort of speaks to this issue of people come into the SEC trying to get relief, and they get in this loop of conversation after conversation, but no actual relief. And so the hope is that by saying to someone, you can come in and you can do a small scale project, limited dollar, limited number of clients, but you can really do it using any conditions that you want, with the idea that you're working towards longer term relief. And so that puts pressure on the person coming in to pick conditions that are reasonable, because if you want to have it continue on, you're going to have to convince the SEC that makes sense. And then obviously anti-fraud rules would apply. And you could sort of plug and play with foreign sandboxes. I proposed it in connection with the UK, the digital securities sandbox. But again, I think of this as something that wouldn't only be limited to crypto, but it could help move some of these crypto projects forward, whether it's on the issuer side or on broker-dealer custody. So that's something that I think would require a little bit of work to put into place, but then could be really helpful.
So I've been practicing law for a while. May look a little younger than that, but I still get very excited going down to the exchanges and especially both exchanges, and seeing a company list as a public company in the United States. I still find that very exciting. I think it's something maybe we take for granted because I think there are not that many countries in the world left where you can bring a company like that to the exchange and have these deep capital markets. But when I started practicing law, we had 8,800 public companies. We're down to maybe 4,400 now. What do you think the cause of that is?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I think this is one of the most exciting things is that you start a company and you grow it. And at some point you want to take it public so that you have access to the broader capital markets and so that you can share your growth with retail investors. And you can get the liquidity that comes with being in the public markets. I think there are a lot of reasons that we're not seeing as many companies go public. I think one is that maybe you don't get the liquidity that you think you would get if you go public. Smaller companies often don't get as good liquidity as they had hoped. One reason is that the private markets have a lot of capital. So there may not be the pressure to move into the public markets. But that means that retail is cut out from that. So this is why for retail investors, that's really not good. Litigation is another reason. I mean, you end up with, you go public and you end up with a lot of shareholder suits that can be very disruptive. You end up with a lot of pressure. You know, people talk about that, the pressure to show quarterly that you're doing, that you're earning. So it's short-termism. That's a complaint I hear a lot. But I think another piece of it that's not talked about enough is that you don't know what it means to become a public company anymore. In the past, it used to mean that you'd have to tell people what your financials were, right? That makes sense. You expect that. But now you walk into the public arena and you don't know what the SEC is going to ask you to disclose, but probably it's going to be, well, not only the SEC, but there's pressure from outside groups as well, asset managers, proxy advisors. And it may be stuff that's extremely difficult, uncomfortable, and awkward for you to be making disclosures about, and really is asking you to take social and political positions on things, which, you know, a company that's just trying to make a product or service to serve other people doesn't really want to get into political and so hot political and social topics. And we're forcing that, or there's a fear that we will. And I think that's very destructive to the capital markets, and certainly a reason that people wouldn't want, companies wouldn't want to go public.
So I joked about admin law before. I've been much more focused on the last few years, and I think we've all learned about the power that the SEC actually has, right, under what it actually can do as a commission. And we've seen a lot of challenges to SEC rules, certainly over the years, but I think many of us have been focused on the last few years. You've written dissents about it. What is the interaction like at the SEC when something gets proposed and some of the commissioners are looking at it, or even some of the in-house lawyers are looking at it and say, this is never going to survive a challenge?
So you mean, what are the dynamics like actually at the commission?
Yes. So something gets proposed and people, I would say practitioners look at it and say, I can't imagine this is going to survive through the courts. And the SEC has lost some things in the courts. Is there a discussion during this process internally about whether or not?
And sometimes there's a discussion at the open meeting.
Yeah.
And, you know, I sort of think of the commission's recent experience in court is not great. We had a period like this before where we were really being criticized on our economic analysis, and it led to the formation of a division of economists. We had economists before, but we really bulked up on our economists, and economic analysis became more serious. It's not to say that we have that perfect, we don't, but it sort of caused us to reassess how we use economic analysis. And I think this latest spate of lawsuits is going to cause us to reassess whether we're listening to our general counsel and other questions about authority. These are serious questions. And so I think realizing that, yeah, you can end up in court having to defend it. So it's better to have that conversation before you finalize the rule, and frankly, before you propose the rule. So I think in the end, this will be good for us in helping us think through, do we have authority to do this? If so, what is that authority?
So you've clearly read a lot of the comment letters that have gone in. We've had a lot of rules, and this committee sent in comment letters under our previous chair, Rod Miller, who's here. What is the best approach for us as a committee and for law firms separately on the comment letters? What do you think? Is there anything that's most helpful?
I mean, I do love comment letters from groups like this. I think they're really, I welcome them from anyone, but these can be very helpful, especially in kind of getting at some of the knottier legal issues where you all have that deep practitioner's experience. And when I hear from a bunch of you together, that's very helpful. I always say, put in an executive summary. It's a little extra work, but it's very helpful. And if you want your letter to get, I mean, sometimes we get tons of letters, and so all the letters will get read. But if you have something that you really want to come talk to us about, come talk to us, give us a call. I think that can be helpful in focusing people on your letter as well.
Well, I'm going to go a little bit unscripted now from the questions. When you say give you a call, who do we call? Because that hasn't worked out so well over the last few years, to be frank with you. The people we used to call and try to have discussions with, that we haven't necessarily had our phone calls returned all the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can certainly call me, and I think all the other commissioners have that same open door policy of you can call, you can get a meeting with us. And, you know, I realize sometimes we're not as useful to talk to as the staff, but if you're calling the staff and you're not getting an answer to your call, you should call me to tell me that the staff's not answering your phone calls. So, you know, again, it's really important for us to understand that when there are these problems, I think the culture right now at the commission isn't the best in terms of interaction with the bar. But that can change, right? We can do better. So, but we can only do better if you tell me if you're experiencing it differently than you used to.
Yeah. So just to be clear, when we have reviews, at least my experience is people do call us back when we have reviews. Maybe not as quickly, and we don't get comments back as quickly, but the staff is very good at getting back to us on actual filings in terms of if we put a call in. But I think that question was really focused on the rules. When we see a rule, it's been a little bit harder to get somebody on the phone. They just say, send a comment letter, send a comment letter. And to your point, I think this verbal back and forth is very helpful.
Yeah, I find that it is. And I think, you know, sometimes it does help to sort of be able to explain, because sometimes when I'm reading a release and it cites a comment letter, it says the commenter said this. I'm not really sure what the commenter meant. I said, well, did you pick up the phone and just call and say, what did you mean by this comment? Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. It's not like we have to pay for every phone call we make. So I mean, sure, it takes time for everyone, but so I do think that interaction is important, and we should be using other methods like having roundtables too on some of these issues. We should be having roundtables before we even put a rule out to figure out if there's a problem that needs to be solved, and maybe if there's some other interesting ideas out there for solving it. So we're not using all of the tools that we have at our disposal, and we're not using the ability to talk to people who are actually working on these issues.
So the next question, I'll summarize a little bit, how we probably best approach filings. I think do you think the best approach is if we're unsure about a filing, something in a filing, of picking up the phone first and trying to clear the issue before making the filing? Or do we make filing and then work to the staff, or it's a balancing act, it seems? I
mean, I would think that often you want to call first and just have the conversation. I think that saves people time. But again, if that has changed too, I need to know that, like, if the ability to have that conversation ahead of time has changed, because I've heard from some people that it has changed. I heard from a very angry director of multiple companies that he said, we used to be able to have these routine conversations and we can't have them anymore. And that seems problematic.
Yeah, because we sometimes also the staff, I don't know how to deal with this. The staff in your review process will all of a sudden take a position which many of us feel is a new position and previous people, we've had some situations where people who worked with the staff saying, wait a second, there's an internal memo of how you view this. And all of a sudden the staff will say, we don't view it that way anymore. And that is where we're stuck, because it's not a rulemaking. I think it's somewhat of a rulemaking, but the staff definitely does these interpretations and switches the interpretation without a rulemaking process. So I guess you say, we'll keep at it and probably call you.
Well, I mean, again, yeah, if you have a problem that you think that I at least should know about, that there's a change in position, I'd like to know that. It may not end up changing the change, but it's worth at least my knowing, so I can say to Corp Fin, hey, what's going on? Why did we change this position? Because I'd like to know that too. Again, I think disclosure review shouldn't be the kind of thing where the commissioners are every day coming in and saying, well, we think you're not making the right comments. But if they've been saying X all for all these years, and then all of a sudden they're saying Y, I think we should all want to know what changed.
So thanks for answering all these questions. I do think, though, overall, I think our system in many ways is still the envy of the world, because in my view, look, Hong Kong and the London Stock Exchange used to be competitors. And you hear more and more about people deciding not to listen to those jurisdictions and coming to the United States. So I still think, even though we have a dearth of public companies, it is still a venue people look up to listen in the United States. And I think overall the staff, regardless of who's in charge, the staff, like I said before, they've been pretty cooperative. We've talked about things where maybe not so cooperative, but overall cooperative. So given it's the night before the election, how are things different under a Trump administration versus a Harris administration, do you think, at the SEC?
Well, first of all, I totally agree with you that our capital markets are still the envy of the world. And I certainly think everyone, no matter who wins the election, we all have that same objective to keep them that way. And so, we should stay focused on that. But that's one of the reasons that I really think it's important that we not try to politicize the work of the commission, because we want investors to know that if they come here, they can buy a company, they can rely on what's in the disclosures, they can rely on what's in the financial statements. And that's a big job, right? It's a big job for people at companies that are preparing these, and it's a big job for us. And that's enough, right? We don't need to try to do more. It's in many ways just a boring job, right? But that's an important job for us to do. There are exciting parts of it, but it's not going to pull us into the most exciting hot topics of the day. But that's not where we belong, right? We just principles-based. You companies tell us about the company through your eyes. That's what we want to know. That's what investors want to know. So what will happen tomorrow? I have no idea. Obviously, none of us has an idea. But I think it goes back to this point. Let's just come together and realize we have a shared treasure. It doesn't matter who you're voting for. We have a shared treasure in the capital markets, and they serve all Americans, and we need to make sure that they continue doing that. And so I hope that whatever administration comes in, we can all just lock arms and say, we are going to recommit ourselves to making these markets remain the shining example for everyone else. We're going to keep this a place where everyone wants to come to raise money and also to build companies. And so I hope that whoever wins, that's what we can do together.
Okay, so should we open it up for Q&A? You're going to get much better questions than I asked you.
No, give me great questions. I'm going to bring a microphone.
We're going to bring you a mic. All right.
Just to follow up on Christian's question about the political aspect here, what do you think would happen with the ESG rules if Mr. Trump gets elected?
Which ESG rules?
The disclosure, the climate
disclosure for public companies. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's being litigated now. So as you know, and I assume that'll be resolved relatively quickly. And so it may not be really up to the new administration. It may be up to the courts. And then it depends what that decision looks like. Again, I think that you've seen that we already have a lot of, if you're worried about ESG disclosures, we've brought enforcement cases on ESG disclosures. We don't need a climate rule for that. And frankly, Europe is already exporting all of its climate regulation here anyway. So I guess they've put us out of, we're not as necessary on that. I mean, I'm a principles-based person, so I don't think we need it in the first place, but now we've got Europe doing their extraterritorial thing, and California doing its thing. So I guess that plays into it as well.
Thank you for being here. My question was actually going in that direction as well, but more so on the states. And, they keep doing things, whether it's California or in that direction, or, Texas or Nebraska in the other direction. Is there any interaction with the commission and the states? And I guess mostly, a lot of that is coming from, the AGs as well. So that's like the first part of my question. The other one is on another topic you mentioned.
Well, I think that there are two different approaches from the states. One is on the disclosure side, and I think Congress has to think about, do we want to have one federal disclosure rule? On the AG side, some states have come in as investors, and they've said we don't want to have an ESG focus in our, we want to be focused on financial returns only. And again, our job is really not to tell investors how they want to invest. So I think that's not something the SEC is going to get involved in. It's really up to investors. I think that we've all done ourselves a little bit of a disservice by, I talk about ESG too, because it's easy to just use that term, but it really doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything because it means different things to everyone. And so, investors for years have been thinking about things that some people would put in the ESG bucket. But now, ESG can mean all kinds of things that are not material also. And so it's very difficult to talk about the issue without trying to get people to be more precise.
And just to your point, which I thought was a good one on, sort of this somewhat shrinking of the capital markets publicly available to retail investors because of the, the burdensome rules, perhaps somewhat because of these disclosure rules. But, we're seeing somewhat that private investments are also now being made available to individuals, ultra high net worth individuals, family offices. Is there any, any specific concerns you have in that space, or intended, possible rulemaking in that space where, sort of, and they may not be true retail, but still, two-legged individuals are starting to have greater access through the industry to private investment opportunities?
Yeah, it's not surprising because the public markets are, companies are waiting so long. And so you're thinking, well, we got to figure out a way for people to get access to that growth and to diversify their portfolios. So it's not surprising to see that. For me, it's not a particular concern because I sort of view the public markets as my ideal system would be you'd have public markets where people could opt into that level of sort of greater disclosure, and you have the framework there. But if people wanted to invest in the private markets, I wouldn't stop them because this is America, and I think people should be able to spend their money however they want. But that's just my bias, which I'm pretty upfront about. I know that most of my colleagues in Washington like to regulate stuff much more than I do. So they're probably more worried about that trend. Now, I do think that it's, if you're trying to get retail investors access, it's really nice if you can come up with products that give them diversified access. So they're getting a portfolio, they're not being too concentrated, and they're getting professional management. That's ideal if you can have that kind of exposure available to them. But there are a lot of issues around that too. People want to serve high net worth investors. Most people putting together private market investments aren't really interested in serving lower net worth retail investors. So I think you got to think about those things on a product by product basis. But again, I'm coming to it from the perspective of the accredited investor rules really annoy me. And a lot of people who talk to me are really mad at us too about those.
Thank you.
Hi, Hester, it's David Huntington. I just have a question going back to the ESG. You mentioned a minute ago that a bunch of the rules are addressing issues that are not particularly material. And then a few minutes ago, you also mentioned that the SEC's got an agenda, but also institutional investors and proxy advisory firms. And one of the core issues that I'd like to be interested to hear your views on, and I think I'm pretty sure you've written on this in some of the rulemakings, is that there seems to be an argument that there's an argument in I believe it's in the adopting release pretty squarely that if you have X number of trillions of dollars of institutional investors who care about something, then it's by definition material. And I always have thought that, the basic V11 said, reasonable investor, you read into that something related to the business of the company, the profits and losses of the company. But if you go down the road of saying, if investors care about it a lot, it's by definition material, then you seem to be potentially completely untethered from at least the understanding of materiality that most of us kind of grew up with.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And it's been good to have this conversation in a way to think about what does that actually mean, the reasonable investor. And from my perspective, you have lots of investors, right? And they care about lots of different things. But the one thing that unites them is they care about financial returns, the long-term financial value of the company. And so that's really what we're looking at, which is why I know some people have criticized the use of the term financial materiality, adding in the financial part. But I do think that that's where materiality flows from, right? It's the common theme that unites all investors. Now, the other part of the problem that I have is that we cite all this investor interest. Well, it's usually asset managers that we're citing. And I really don't value that much what an asset manager says, because what matters is what the investors say, which may be a fund. And if the asset manager has signed some pledge saying that it has to get data about climate, for example, and so it's getting data about climate, that doesn't tell me anything about what the underlying funds that they're advising want, and what their objectives are. So I think that I usually don't love when we are citing those statistics, because I don't think they're that meaningful either.
So, kind of staying on the political, just in the last month, you've had to appear in front of Congress. We've had at least one of the presidential candidates talk about politicizing agencies generally more than they already are, which would be a different source of pressure on the commission. I think what Christian has been talking about in terms of responsiveness of the staff, I've had a number of former staff people say that they didn't feel comfortable responding to calls because they were being either second guessed or feeling that they were being second guessed. It seems like Corp Fin has been staffed with academics more than practitioners, and it might make sense at the commission level to have people who are actually thinking big picture, but trickling it down to Corp Fin has sort of created this morass. If you were to be the new chair of the commission, would you wave your wand and do anything different to address all these pressures and also still buttress what seems to be an internal lack of morale and at what I think historically has been one of the best staffs around?
Well, I think it is the best staff. I mean, of course, I am biased, but I've worked in and around the SEC for a long time, and there are so many really smart people there. And I think part of what the commission needs to do is just kind of give them the freedom to to be smart, right? And to interact with people and to work through difficult problems. There are a lot of these problems that are really interesting. And I said our job was boring, but there are really interesting legal problems, right? And so the reason we hire all these brilliant people is so that they can work on these interesting legal problems. And we have to give them the authority to do that. So I think that's one piece of it, is really giving them the ability to say, no, we actually expect you to dive into this problem and work with people inside and outside the commission to get to the right place. In terms of political accountability, I absolutely think that we owe it to Congress to tell them what we're doing so that they understand whether we're using the authority that they gave us the way they want us to use it. That can be uncomfortable. No one likes to go in front of Congress and answer a lot of questions. That's never fun. No offense to anyone from Congress, but I mean.
Well, you seem pretty good at doing it. You do it.
No, but I mean, this is what Congress's job, oversight role, is to ask us questions, and so we should answer those. But again, I mean, I think a lot of what matters at the SEC is just remembering that we are shepherding this beautiful treasure, which is the capital markets, which can serve our country and the whole world, frankly, so well, right? We can make people's lives better by having the capital markets work better. We can make their lives better by ensuring that more Americans participate in them as investors and as companies founders of companies that can draw from those capital markets. That's an exciting mission, right? I mean, we can actually do good for the prosperity of the people of this country if we do our job well. And so I hope that whoever is, on the commission a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, can remember how exciting that is and can remind the staff of what an important role they play in making those capital markets work well. And I mean, I've disagreed with so many of the rules that we've adopted or proposed in recent years, but it is remarkable to me as a former rule writer how hard the staff works to try to get to the right place. They have to do what the commission says, right? They can't go off and say, well, this isn't what we want to do. They have to do it. And they are working under tremendous time pressure and tremendous volumes of comments that they have to get through. And they're trying to get to the best place they can get. And I think just reminding them of this is a bigger mission and this is really important and we care what you think. And we care how they're, we want them to approach problems, as I said. So, and to do so with their full analytical, and give us their best thought about how to approach a problem. I think we can bring that morale back up. And I mean, part of it, I think, frankly, is not being all together in the building. I think it's not ideal. And so I'd love to see more in-person stuff as well. I think that can be really encouraging to people.
We have one more over here.
Hi, Commissioner Peirce. I'm Del Rodriguez. Earlier, you said that there are some basic rules that might be beneficial to tackle, for the commission to tackle. Could you speak more to that?
Yeah, one I would tackle, which a lot of commissioners have talked about, for a long time now, is transfer agent rulemaking. I think we could modernize the transfer agent rules. I'd love to see that happen. And then capital formation is an area that we haven't paid as much attention to. And I think there's some tweaks we can make on crowdfunding. We saw during the pandemic that it actually was a pretty useful way for people to for small companies to raise capital, but there's some changes that we can make to make it more cost effective, like to do something on finders as well. And I think we've spent a lot of time, and this is a perpetual thing. Every chairman comes in and says, oh, let's look at equity market structure and let's do something big in equity market structure. And I think that there's always something we can do on that side. We've done a couple big rules there recently, but we spend less time thinking about the fixed income markets. And I think it might make more sense for us to do some of that. And again, we need to get a lot of outside input. So I don't want to jump in and say what we need to do on that side, but I wouldn't mind having a fixed income advisory committee again to help us think through some of those issues.
So the American Bar Association wrote to the commission a while ago on capital formation and things outside of capital formation that the commission had not looked at in quite some time, that might fall into the rubric of basic things. Among those, for example, social media, the fact that since we're living with the 2000 release in 2024 on securities and the internet, although things have changed a good deal since. In communications rules generally, haven't really had anything since securities offering reform in communications, though one could say that it's the same piecemeal approach that the commission has taken toward integration until we had the 2020 approach to kind of looking at integration as a whole, in terms of that. And going back to the theme of earlier this evening on engaging with the commission and having communications with the commission, I would echo Christian's point that while it's fine and it's lovely to be able to call the commissioners and the commissioner's staff, oftentimes that's not necessarily a real world opportunity for us unless it's through a bar association. If we don't want to create a lot of hostility with the folks that we're interacting with in Corp Fin or chief accountant's office. And it really, really is not the same SEC Corp Fin staff or chief accountant staff that I grew up dealing with, where you could exchange ideas and try and get to a solution or find just get feedback. Now it's very much type in your request online in the online form, and perhaps we'll get back to you, or we may get back to you. And then it's a very conditional answer, if any answer. So it is a completely different ballgame. And for securities lawyers, it is very much kind of a wall of not getting any response at all, usually, or at least not a response that's at all helpful, if you get one. So it is a completely different thing, and not really any receptiveness even to providing discussion, on things like interpretations on, for example, rules that have been adopted, like the SEC, when the SEC finalized the SPAC rules and the staff began adopting them or interpreting them in the reverse merger context, and continues to adopt them in the reverse merger context when you're reverse merging into an operating company in life sciences. And the staff and lots of accounting firms have had the same experience that we as law firm have had. The staff, doesn't provide compliance and disclosure interpretations, and you can't get a straight answer. So it's really difficult to provide in a service business a viewpoint when you can't get any feedback.
When did you notice that changed?
On the staff in terms of the reverse merger?
Well, not necessarily the reverse merger, just this idea of there's no interaction. It's all very formalized and you might not get an answer.
Oh, when Gary arrived.
So, I mean, obviously this is concerning to hear that. And I agree with you that the call commissioner option is not, it's not the answer to everything. And I think it's probably the answer to more things than people think it is because, you know, yeah, you might say, I mean, especially if 10 different people are having the same problem, then I can raise it and say, hey, what are you doing in this area? If it's one company, I agree, harder. Although I have, in instances where I've done that, I always ask the company, or is it okay if I go to the staff and if I tell them this is an issue? And if they tell me yes, then I'll do it. If they tell me no, I won't. But anyway, you know, that really, on the social media point, that's a great suggestion. I'm going to add that to the list. I think that's very, very good suggestion. On the other point, I think we can change that culture, right? I mean, if the message being sent from the 10th floor is you can't engage on things, then that's what's going to happen. People won't engage. If the message being sent is we want you to engage, I hope that can change, right? You know, that's that, and I think a big part of that is just really, again, unlocking the staff's ability to use to work through those hard problems. So I'm optimistic that can change. But again, you all have to keep telling me these things, right? I don't see that unless you tell me. And so people shouldn't be waiting 4 years to tell me this, right? And then on the implementation point, we do not do implementation well. It's very frustrating to me. I get all these assurances that it's being handled well, but I think it's just something that we have to figure out how to do better. And I don't know whether it's you know, formalizing, setting up a team of people who are going to be responsible for just answering questions on things. If you have ideas about that, I'd really.
When the jobs act was implemented, the staff got compliant disclosure interpretations almost immediately and kept putting them out. And so it's not like the SEC doesn't know how or that they didn't do this before. They have, you know, we've all seen it, we've all experienced it. So it's happened before. It could happen again. It's just not happening now with any of the recent rulemakings. Like we've had very few compliance and disclosure interpretations, or we've had the CNDIs come out like the day before or 2 days before it was necessary, which is just.
I know that's not helpful because then you've done something and you find out it's not what.
You wasted a whole bunch of time and money, clients' money.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry on behalf of the commission for this. I mean, I know that doesn't carry much water, but it's good for me to hear this so I can see what I can do from my vantage point.
That'd be great, because I think one thing to stress is the culture is there, is your point. The culture is there because that's how we've always practiced. We've always had this interaction and we've always tried to all get to the answer together. And that's really gone away. I think you broke the ice when you said it went away with the new chair.
Although that, like the PLI, the annual PLI that we all go through, I think it's always touted as like the best engaged, one of the best engaged staff and commissioners. And I remember you gave a speech similar about protecting the staff and the morale issues. And it was funny because Corp Fin said, okay, we're here to engage. And then gave literally lecture after lecture after lecture on the new rules and took no Q&A. And so it's just like, and literally the director is like, we're engaging now and we're out here in the public and engaging and it was just sort of
After having canceled that
yeah.
Yeah, well, the canceling was in part because, so when you have an event where all the SEC, all the division directors, all the commissioners are speaking, it's good to have that open to the public. And so I think that that was certainly one of the concerns. And I think now that's been ameliorated to some degree. But, I agree that we need to have that back and forth interaction. And I think that that's a bigger theme that's a problem at the commission right now. And part of that comes from, I think, a little bit of a lack of humility on the part, it's very easy to be working on things and to assume that you know what the problem is and what the right solution is. But we all need input, right? We all need to get input, and especially getting it from people who have been in the trenches working on issues. I find it really helpful to hear from people who have recently been outside the commission. What are the big problems that people are facing? So, but yeah, we can certainly do a better job on that. So I hear that message loud and clear.
Hi. One of the frustrations that I've had in practice the last couple of years is it seems like the fundamental premise of what I thought was the fundamental premise of securities law is that disclosure is king seems to be changing. And I wonder a lot whether the commission has a distrust of a retail investor's ability to digest the disclosures that companies make. And this is something that seems to come through also in a lot of the statements that the commissioners make, or maybe things that you see from the investor advocate. And so I'm wondering, is that something that you've experienced too in reviewing some of the materials that the commission or the commissioners put out? And how do we get back to a place where we can advise our clients, that these are the disclosure rules, this is what's required, to meet these obligations, and to have a little bit more predictability in the way that, rules are going to be applied?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The SEC, I think of the SEC as being a disclosure regulator, right? You tell people what you're doing and what you're selling, and then people can make their own decision of whether they want to buy it or not. And that seems like a really valuable role to play. There's another type of securities regulator which says we're going to decide what people can buy, but I don't think that's what Congress set us up to do. So, but I will tell you that it's very tempting for a regulator, even one like me, who likes, I think people should be able to do whatever they want as long as they're not hurting anyone else, basically. So I come at it from, in terms of, people wanting to buy something, right? I might not think that you should buy a Lamborghini, but if that's what you want to do with your money, that's sort of up to you. But I think because we see so much bad activity in our enforcement actions, it's very hard to not say, oh, if I could just jump in and tell someone not to buy that, because it would save that person a lot of heartache. And sometimes that paternalistic attitude, it's very easy for you to forget as a regulator, wait a minute, I don't sit in the shoes of that person who's making that decision. I don't know what that person, what that person's hopes and dreams and resources and future earning potential and desire to learn a little bit by investing some money in the market. I don't know those things. And so sometimes you have to kind of remind yourself to take a step back and say, nope, this is America. People get to make their own decisions. So I do think there's a little bit of a loss in faith and disclosure. But I think that's something that we could probably reclaim. I do think that there's something that we could do on the side of investor education. That's not necessarily an SEC job only, but we could do a much better job giving people better arming people better to go into the markets. And I think that needs to start really young in elementary school. We should be teaching kids. So I think there's some positive that can be done there. And I will say that people have good intentions. So it's important to remember that. I mean, sometimes we do get that balance wrong, but I think people's intentions are good.
Well, I'll just add something to that. Early in my legal career, the SEC adopted the plain English rules, which I think are great because it made things simpler for an investor. And I don't think it also forced practitioners to actually explain what the product was. And I always think that's helpful. I always thought if a practitioner can't explain it in plain English, then the practitioner doesn't understand it. But if I look over my career at all the things that got added, we're losing the whole concept of plain English, because now the cover page requirements mean the cover page is 4 pages long. And I think that is, and I recently had an interaction with some of the staff within the last 6 months. The person was very nice. We had a nice chat about our review, and they said, "Hey, can we ask a question?" I said, "Sure." It's like, how are you doing under the new rules? What do you think? And that was a break from what we've been seeing. I was like, "Oh, this is like the good old days when we go back and forth." I said, "I think that the cover page being 4 pages is probably not a great idea because people get completely lost." And I think that's about things that change. Maybe that concept should come back. I understand that we're going to have movements for more disclosure, but I think in the context, we have to think about where it fits in because we're losing plain English a little bit with all the requirements coming back.
I would be really happy if we applied plain English to our own documents
I didn't want to be
that we
rude,
wait, but
yeah, it would be good if some of the rules and the proposals came in plain English.
But no, I think that point is a really good one, and it was really brought home to me. It's something I was looking at recently where, you know, the disclosure that we found problematic was short, and it did not cover everything it needed to cover, but it did a really good job at focusing the investor's mind on what the investor needed to think about. Then by the time the disclosure changed to meet our requirements, right? And so by the time then it had gotten longer, and I was like, oh, no investor is going to read this at all. So that even though it's more complete, it's not going to be as effective. And so I think you're right. We keep wanting to throw stuff in. And maybe this is something that investor testing can help us with, to sort of remind us, you know what, a few basic things can be more powerful than trying to throw everything in there. I think some of our work on summary prospectuses, for example, for mutual funds has been really useful at helping us really think about that. Form CRS, not so much, but so I also think another piece that we're missing out on is we're so paper-based that we're missing out on this whole revolution that all different kinds of digital disclosure could give us. And I think it's just really hard for people to experiment with that kind of thing as well.
I think that's it. Christina? All right, well.
Christina, Christian, thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you
coming
all
here.
for your feedback. It's really helpful. Appreciate it.
Thank you all for coming.